In this video, I'm going to explain what flow is, and then I'm going to share with you some of the underlying principles so that you can then apply the idea of flow in your own animations. Hey guys, today I'm going to teach you about putting flow into your movements when you're making animations. So first of all, I want to just get past a distinction between flow and smooth or smoothness. So flow is this is my definition, by the way, it's no one else's. I just created this definition. It's the construction of frames in a sequence which is mindful of the frames before and sometimes after, but mostly before, in a way which has aesthetic appeal and it's not affected by the frame rate. The aesthetic appeal part, it doesn't have to have aesthetic appeal, it just kind of has aesthetic appeal as a consequence of being in a state of flow. So it's not really, you don't really need to worry about the aesthetic appeal. If you make something flow, it will kind of have appeal because of it. Also, the after part, it's not always in this kind of state of anticipation, but it is always in this state of being affected by the frames previous to it. So in this diagram, you can see that I show that there's kind of a ripple effect in animation in the frames, because they will always be affected. The frames will always be affected by what happened before it, if anything has affected it to change its state. So smoothness is kind of it's a bit more arbitrary in this sense. It just relates to the frame rate and the animation, and whether it's on 1s, 2s or 3s, or whether it's playing at 12 frames per second or 24 frames per second. If you change it to be on 24 frames per second instead of, on 3s, it's on 1s, it won't necessarily make your animation flow better. It will make it smooth, but smoothness is not always a better thing. But flow is characterized by what you do within the drawings of your frames. So, if you've got a person, the drawings of the frames will affect the flow, whereas the smoothness is more just the frames themselves. There is still a lot of importance with shuffling about your frames and deciding which frame rate they're on, but it's not the same as flow. So I just wanted to get that distinction out of the way so it doesn't confuse anyone. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the first sort of idea that I had for teaching flow, which is the continuation of momentum. So in this, it's got two kind of scientific sort of ideas, very basic scientific ideas. One is that energy is required to change something's velocity. That can be to slow it down or to speed it up. Energy is required for that. The other is that energy is not created or destroyed. It merely changes state. So in a lot of these things, if you're animating an object, maybe the energy might go from one area of it to another, or if you're working with a body or an organism, the energy can be transferred around, especially if they're linked kinetically to each other. So arcs are also, by a consequence of this, arcs are more efficient for moving for changing directions than just stopping and then changing direction and starting again. Going in an arc has a better way, and that's why we see it all the time in nature. We see it like everywhere in organic movement, and that's because of the efficiency in conserving momentum and not having to change the velocity in a drastic way. So it's all about not having to change the velocity that much. So you see when a car is racing, he'll race around the corner like this and it will be a nice smooth arc, and that way he won't have to energy won't be taken out to change the velocity, and he can conserve the energy here. So this movement, contrastingly, if he were to go in that kind of path, that would take way more energy away from the speed, and what he's doing there would take a lot more energy. If that car has any weight at all, it would require an enormous amount of power. So here I've just demonstrated it in a slightly different way. You see, if you're trying to meet these 3 points, it's more efficient to go around like that. And so this comes up in organic motion all the time. So this one's more applies to any kind of body movement. The general principle is that the movement will start in here at the core where all of the weight is, and this is kind of like the root of all of your weight is in the pelvic floor, and then that ripples outwards. So it also, in the human body, it ripples upwards to the chest and the head, and then from the chest, you know, the shoulders are kind of the root of any arm movement, past this area, and then they just extend outwards to the fingertips, and similarly with the legs all the way down to the toes. So if you have a movement and you want it to flow nicely, well, the movement will probably start here and will travel down any of the limbs. And if the movement, if the body requires something to change down here, it can't just go straight to here. It has to take effect by going down the leg first. So the change has to start here, then here, then here, then here. Okay, and then I just drew a similar one for a horse because you know, there's lots of different animals that you can animate. I couldn't draw them all, but with a horse, I feel like just from watching it run, that this would count as the root, and that's because a horse tends to do this when it gallops. And so you see that kind of, it's kind of like a ripple effect going off towards the head, just very, very slightly, but this entire area has a lot of weight to it. But yeah, that they travel down the leg as well, and you can see this quite clearly when they run, that this joint here massively affects that joint, and it works in a sort of ribbon motion, which I'll get to later. So here I just wanted to show the ripple effect applied in my own drawings, so that you can see that it works, you know, in the arms, especially in sort of dance moves. I'm working with a lot of dance right now, which is why I'm kind of talking about this topic. So you can see that somewhere like in the hand, you've got the elbow that's making the movement here, and then it's traveling to the wrist, and there's a sort of lag time between that. So the hand is sort of a little bit delayed behind the elbow and the wrist, and so the fingertips. And this is, you know, this kind of bend is quite nice, and you can see this in other areas of nature, such as in like, if you look at a tree in the wind, it will perform the same kind of move. And that's one thing I really like about dance and about other things like combat. You know, in Kung Fu, they used to impersonate different areas of nature. So they would have different Kung Fu moves for the waves of the ocean. They would have moves for trees in the wind, or for different animals like monkeys and grasshoppers and things. They would impersonate them, and I really like that. So yeah, that was just, you know, I am applying these in my own sketches, and it's working quite well. Okay, so I was going to talk about the ribbons and whips and chains and those kind of things, the kind of things that have, you know, they really embody what flow is, because they have such a vast series of interconnected pivots. But here's the misconception. Most people look at a chain, or let's say this is a ribbon, okay? They look at a ribbon effect and they can only see this, okay? That's the traveling movement for them. And for this, it's very mesmerizing if you look at this traveling movement. But what they don't see, which is really what is behind the magic of that movement, is this area here. And that is one of the keys to animating it, is to pay attention to this area traveling along here. You see that mound? And you see how that mound moves along. So this is a really interesting concept, and there's still a lot of mystery to it to me. But once you pay attention to this, you're able to understand it a little bit more for how it operates. Similarly, you can see the one that is just springing up here. A new one is formed at the base here where the main pivot is. You see it formed here, and then it quickly grows over this frame, and then after that it will sort of, move along. It will just keep moving along and then disappear. So yeah, that's really interesting. The other thing you can see is that if you track the points of a ribbon like this, let's say we simplify it into different joints, like in the joints of an arm or something, you can see that this is an interesting pattern. The first joint here, which is closer to the area of the pivot, the main pivot, that will have a less eccentric kind of movement. It will be a bit more predictable. It will just kind of ease in and out of this movement here. Now, as you go further along, this becomes more erratic. So as I've shown in this example here, it becomes more erratic like this. And then once you're in the third part here on this one, it's just going really crazily, but it's still following a pattern. The only reason why it appears to be more erratic when it's still predictable in a way is because it's being affected by this one, which is being affected by this one, and it's sort of like having it's kind of like an exponential increase, or like a squared number, a number that's multiplied by itself. So that's a really interesting pattern. I'm not saying I have all the answers for these things, but when you observe these things, it really does bring life into your animation, especially with flow. So here's the same kind of concept, but demonstrated in an intentional movement. So this is line, the first example. Okay, so this is, if this line here, let's say this is a fluid line and it wants to get to this state here. So this is one way of doing it, and this has like no flow in there. It just moves. It's got a bit of easing then that I showed with the separation of where the frames are, but in general it's got really no flow. Now here, this example, I've just demonstrated it with straight lines, and then I've demonstrated it with curved lines here. So this is ultimately the most fluid of the three states. But this, I've got straight lines. Now imagine this is the end of one, it's the end of it, and then this is the end of the next frame, and then this is the end of the next frame here. So you can see that this side moves first, because in this example we're imagining that this is kind of the leader. It's at the base of whatever limb or whatever object. So this moves first, and you see this one's lagging behind. It's actually not moved yet. Then it's almost got to the other side before this one's even hardly moved away. So in this example now, all you see that pattern, but it's spread out so that every part along here is affected in that same way, and that's what gives you the curve. So yeah, in here you also see that it starts to create this sort of shape like this now. So now you've got a double curve, you've got sort of a double arc on there, and I really like this. In fact, I feel like there's so much more that you can express in a curved line than in a straight line. I mean, like a massive difference. You can express so much in a curve that in a straight line there's a very small amount of information that's transferred. In fact, in a program like Adobe Flash, the way it's able to keep all the files in a very small compact data size is that it interprets every line as a straight line going from one place to another. It does not really interpret curves. It only sees a curve as a series of straight lines. And that's how it's able to formulate all of that data in a very small file size. In fact, what a curve has is a lot of character in there and a lot of sort of implications and deeper meanings within there. So that's like a really interesting sort of idea about shapes and what they mean. So this is a slightly easier one, more obvious to handle. Motion trails, smears, and blurs. So trails are, the reason that they come into this and they're not a separate principle is that they're mindful of where the previous frame was positioned. Now, if you remember back to when I was talking about this model here, you can see that they have to be mindful of where they were before, and that can be demonstrated in a motion blur or a smear or a trail, whatever you want to call them. So I've just put a few examples of how you can use that effect. So you can have it kind of stretch out in your in-betweens, your breakdown frames. You can have multiples that you can see here. You can see that it's kind of duplicates, and that creates this kind of it's an interesting sort of effect. And you can have what I call my signature motion blur. It's not really my signature, but it's just something that you can see in a lot of my animations. I've got a tutorial on that already, so I won't go into a lot of depth over how you can apply them. So this is a concept that I wanted to sort of debunk. So some teachers will tell you that all of your frames need to be on model at all times. I disagree with that, so I'm going to put a big cross through that because I find that makes your animations very sort of boring, and it really limits what you can do with animation, especially in terms of an aesthetic style that you have. If you're constantly worrying that all of the frames are on model, I think it can limit you. Yeah, so you'll find that is a thing that they have in the industry, in studios. They want everything to be on model. That's fine. I understand why they do that, but if you're trying to express yourself and create your own household name, then you might want to consider just going all out with your creativity on things like this. So this is my kind of counter principle, which is your breakdown frames especially, but really most of your frames should be describing the forces at work and what has happened before the frame. So they should be like, you should be able to see just from one frame cut out, not the whole story, but indications and a sort of, it paints a picture of what might be happening in the few seconds that are surrounding that frame. So for this one, I can see that certain things are at work. So obvious one with the motion blur here, the foot has been coming from here, it's been lifted up. You can also see things like, this is another principle, but there's tension here because the arms have already come back and they're kind of at their maximum stretchiness here, and now the musculature and the tendons are resisting that from being pulled back anymore. So yeah, you have a nice arc there. You can also see that the foot is fully extended here, so it's pushed off of the ground, indicating that the character was on the ground before. Okay, so there's a few things there. Similarly with this character, you've got this sort of, again, you've got the tension here. The head and the hair has been sort of, it's sort of in a drag motion, so that indicates that it's been higher and now it's moved lower. You've got the arms, which I mean across the chest as well, use of tension there, but you see how the arms are in this sort of arc here. Now we can apply that principle that we know, that the ripple effect, so the fingers are sort of following on from where the shoulder and the other joints have led the fingers. So you can see that there's sort of an indication that over time they've been manipulated in that way. So I would argue that they've come from around here. You see? Same goes for this one. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that we can just work out just from that picture. If we had a different one which didn't have many indications of flow or anything like that, it would look a lot less dynamic as well. It would look less like it was, you know, a still shot in something that was moving, and it would look like, this is how I describe it, it looks like the characters are posing for like a photo shoot. I often cringe at photo shoots in real life, because you can see that someone's like pretending to do something, but they've been stood still that whole time, and that's because the forces at work are not being demonstrated or described in the pose. So this applies to real life a little bit as well. Before moving on, we're going to go to our Animator Spotlight of the week. This one goes to Krylex. He plucks up the courage to show his work on the Animator Guild Discord group, and I can see he's been playing with some nice camera angles here in this clip and some pretty crazy loose animation involving water. So yeah, well done to him. Yeah, just keep it loose like this. It's really nice, and I'm sure if you continue down this path, you're going to make some really cool animations in the future. If you would like to be featured in a future video, just send me your animation and you might be picked. Okay, back to the lesson. So a little bit more advice. Reference. That's like my catchphrase when giving people advice when they ask for advice. Study a lot of high quality reference from different examples. And I love this word, impersonations. This is one of my favorite words, and I don't fully understand what an impersonation is, but here's my guess at what it is. It's like it's like trying to be something but not being fully consciously aware of 100% of why that thing is the way it is. So with a reference, you don't need to necessarily have all of the answers there in front of you as to why someone walks in that way, or why an acrobat, like an acrobatic movement, has those sort of quirks in there. But you can still observe it and sort of deconstruct it in that way and then apply that to your own. So yeah, try and make impersonations, you know, or impressions is another word that maybe you can use. Of course, this doesn't really help unless you have practiced it. So like a large part of this is just practicing what you're doing, but then consciously also trying to put these things in place. I usually recommend just having one or two of these principles at the front of your mind while you're animating. Don't try and use all of them, because humans are terrible at multitasking, especially me. I'm bad at multitasking, so I can only have like one, maybe two things in the front of my mind that I'm consciously acting upon. So choose one of them and just do them at, you know, do one of them in your animation exercise and then move on to the next one of these principles. So yeah, and then go with your instinct. So once you've been practicing, your instinct will just take over, and you'll find that there is this sort of inner voice that will just tell you what it thinks, and you should trust this inner voice, because that inner voice in your brain is linked to the wider cortexes of your brain, which are far more sort of powerful than your conscious mind. So this is like, it's got access to like the archives of your memory, where you've seen thousands of faces and people and things, so it has all of that to draw on, your subconscious mind. So you've got to listen to it, and you listen to that with your instinct. Okay. So also flow, I don't want to paint it as this be-all end-all thing. It's just one element of animation. It's closely tied to other principles, things like easing and squash and stretch and arcs, of course. So you've got to study all of them really to get a good idea. And it's not always necessary. It's not always necessary to have really pronounced capitalized flow. Like, someone doesn't need to exclaim, wow, that's got so much flow. You can just have it subtly, or you can take away flow in certain circumstances. It sometimes works really well in comedy to take away some of these elements like flow from a piece of animation, and then it creates more laughs because it's not like something we've seen before. And in a future episode, I know I mentioned tension in one of the breakdowns, so I will try and make another video at some point on tension in the body and how it can lead to some really nice experiments when it comes to things like dance choreography especially, and just acrobatics and kinetic movement. I really love studying those kind of things. They're just really fun. I like seeing how bodies can be taken to the extreme when it comes to animation. Also, when it comes to practicing, the tutorial by itself isn't going to make you better. You need to, act upon these things. And I invite you to subscribe to my channel, because I have a lot of these videos. So if you subscribe, you'll be able to, access them whenever you like, easily. And you'll also, of course, be notified of when my new videos come out. I tackle quite a range of topics, but they're all kind of around animation, illustration, design, and I'm trying to branch out in different topics. I will be doing that in the future. Also, I have a website called animatorguild.com. I really suggest you go over there. I've put a lot of work into it, and I offer some really unique services over there, such as one-on-one tuition if you want to get really good at animation really fast, and have specific problems solved that you have. So you can sign on to the one-on-one workshops over there. You can also look at my online store where I have different downloads of source files. And I also have kind of source file and tutorial packages to go along with that. These are like, you can watch the tutorial and open up the source files and, look through the source files to see what's going on there. So that can be really helpful if you're learning animation. And also I have links to where you can buy software, hardware, books, DVDs that I strongly recommend. And I've got an online forum. So the forum is really good for, networking with other animators, collaborating, discussing on different topics that you want, getting feedback. Just head over there and see what you find. Bye. There is a problem here. With the leading edge, you do have to treat it differently than the trailing edge. You see how the trailing edge with this part, hold on, there we go. The trailing edge, I put almost an equal amount